Dear friends, last time we read chapter 10 of the book of Revelation, and I explained that the open book in the hand of the angel coming down from heaven symbolized the decree of divine government, that is the way the Lord wants to save the world. It is the same book which we see in chapter 5. The Lamb opened it, and now the angel of the Lord gives it to John that he may assimilate the message before proclaiming it. What's the concrete content of that scroll? This we shall see with chapter 11. So we begin reading chapter 11 of the Apocalypse. Then I was given a measuring rod like a staff, and I was told, "Rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship there. But do not measure the court outside the temple. Leave that out, for it is given over to the nations, and they will trample over the holy city for 42 months. And then begin another section, the two witnesses, which we shall see later in this conference. But let us first focus on the first two verses. John is given a measuring rod and is told, "Rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship there." Let us not forget that this is symbolic language. It is not a temple made of stones. The holy city is not the earthly Jerusalem. And remember that the Jerusalem temple has been destroyed by the Romans in 70 after Christ. So it's not the Jerusalem stone temple. It is a symbol. Symbol of what? Well, all the books of the New Testament help us to understand that this is an image for the church. Already in the Gospel of John chapter 2, Jesus compares his own body to a shrine. Destroy this sanctuary, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And his first epistle, St. Peter tells the Christians that they are a spiritual temple, a living temple. So it is an image of the church. The church is a spiritual temple where Christians have to worship God. So rise and measure the temple of God, the altar, and those who worship there. Those who worship there and the altar in the Jerusalem temple, there, as I said in previous conferences, there were two altars. And anyway, those two altars were almost in the center of the Jerusalem temple. So here, the Apocalypse speaks of what is at the center of the church, spiritual center, those who really adore God, who live by adoration. They are not only Christians by name or by tradition, they actually worship God in the church. And John is asked to measure the temple of God, the altar, those who worship there, but not to measure the court outside the temple. Leave that out. It is given over to the nations, and they will trample over the holy city for 42 months. The images are drawn from the Jerusalem temple, even though here it is about the church. Now, in the Jerusalem temple, there were several courts. You had the external court, the court of the Gentiles, and Gentiles could not go further. They were prohibited to do so. Only the Jews could go further. Then there was another court, and there the Jewish women were supposed to stay there. Only Jewish men could enter further, and so on and so on. You had the court of the priest, and uh, eventually you had the last court, the last space where actually only the high priest could enter once a year on the day of expiation, the Holy of Holies. So actually you had a succession of courts, and the most internal court, the Holy of Holies, was considered to be the holiest part of the Jerusalem temple. So here, by way of analogy, the holiest part of the church is made up of actually those who worship God. But the court outside the temple, leave that out, for it is given over to the nations, and will trample over the holy city for 42 months. 42 months, we already saw that duration. It is 3.5 years. Symbolically, it is a period of serious religious persecution. And during that time, the court outside the temple will be trampled by the nations, which seems to be a way of suggesting that the outside part of the church will be kind of contaminated by paganism. Well, we know, and the history of the church shows it, that very often some parts of the church are contaminated by paganism. And as far as the apocalypse is concerned, remember, for example, the letters to Pergamum and Thyatira, where we see that contamination by paganism. So there shall be a space delimited by John, symbolically, which shall not be contaminated by paganism. And then begins a new section, the two witnesses. And I will grant my two witnesses power to prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. Notice it is the same period, 1,260 days, and this corresponds to the 42 months. During that time, when the nations will trample the court outside the temple, the Lord will give power to his two witnesses to prophesy, clothed in sackcloth. These are the two olive trees and the two lampstands which stand before the Lord of the earth. And if anyone would harm them, fire pours from their mouth and consumes their foes. If anyone would harm them, thus he is doomed to be killed. They have power to shut the sky, that no rain may fall during the days of their prophesying. They have power over the waters to turn them into blood, and to afflict the earth with every plague, as often as they desire. And when they have finished their testimony, the beast that ascends from the bottomless pit will make war upon them and conquer them and kill them. And their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which is allegorically called Sodom and Egypt, where their Lord was crucified. For 3 days and a half, men from the peoples and tribes and tongues and nations gaze at their dead bodies and refuse to let them be placed in a tomb. And those who dwell on the earth will rejoice over them, make merry and exchange presents, because these two prophets have been a torment to those who dwell on the earth. But after the 3.5 days, the breath of life from God entered them, and they stood up on their feet, and a great fear fell on those who saw them. Then they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, "Come up here." And in the sight of their foes, they went up to heaven in a cloud. That seems, at first view, to be an enigmatic passage of the Apocalypse, and yet I think it is one of the most crucial passages of Revelation crucial for the understanding of the book. First question, where is this story happening? We read at verse 8, their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which is allegorically called Sodom and Egypt, where their Lord was crucified. What is this great city? Some scholars suggest it is Rome. Others suggest it is Jerusalem, where their Lord was crucified. Actually, it is neither Rome nor Jerusalem. The great city is Babylon. And remember that it is a spiritual city. And the inhabitants of the earth who rejoice over the death of the two witnesses and exchange presents, well, they are the Babylonians, actually, the citizens of Babylon. And how could we understand Babylon is the place where the Lord was crucified? Well, let us remember what Jesus said to Saul of Tarsus at the time of his conversion on his way to Damascus. Acts of the Apostles 9:3. Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? I am Jesus, whom you persecute. Actually, Jesus was no longer living on earth. He was already in heaven. And Saul of Tarsus was persecuting disciples of Jesus. And Jesus told Saul that actually it was himself, Jesus, whom Paul was persecuting. So we understand that in every place where Jesus' disciples are persecuted, Jesus is persecuted. In every place disciples of Jesus are put to death, Jesus is crucified again. So I think the great city is Babylon. The two witnesses, what do they represent? Some people try to identify them, trying to find some historical characters who could be those the book of Revelation would be alluding to. But I think we have to keep into account symbolic language. The two witnesses are a symbol. But symbol of what? We are told that there are the two olive trees and the two lampstands which stand before the Lord of the earth. Let us first focus on the second image because it is the easiest one to interpret. Two lampstands. Well, you see, there's just one other place in the Apocalypse where we see lampstands. It is in the inaugural vision, chapter 1, the risen Christ appearing to John. Christ appears in the middle of 7 golden lampstands and tells John that the 7 golden lampstands are the 7 churches of Asia. So the lampstand in the book of Revelation is an ecclesiological symbol, the church. So I think the two witnesses are the church, but again, let us not forget that a symbol is not just a reality, it is a particular point of view. And what is the point of view here on the church? First, why are there two? Should we conclude that maybe the two witnesses would be 2 of the 7 churches of Asia? The faithful one, maybe, Smyrna and Philadelphia, who don't receive any criticism? I don't think so. Remember, too, that the Apocalypse speaks the language of the Old Testament. 2 witnesses. Why 2 witnesses? because it was a requirement of the law of Moses. Look, for example, Deuteronomy 19:15. It is in order for a testimony to be valid from a juridical point of view, you would need at least two witnesses. One witness is just not enough. Yes, we read in Deuteronomy 19:15, a single witness shall not prevail against a man for any crime or for any wrong in connection with any offense that he has committed. Only on the evidence of two witnesses or three witnesses shall a charge be sustained. And you find that requirement again in the Gospel of John, chapter 8. Jesus argues in front of some Jews that, yes, his testimony is valid because he's testifying for himself, and the Father is also testifying through the works Jesus is performing. You find it also in the first epistle of Paul to Timothy 5:19. So, the two witnesses in Revelation 11 are two, so that their testimony would be valid and could not be rejected by the Babylonians. So, I think the two witnesses symbolize the church giving testimony to Christ in Babylon. Now, they are clothed in sackcloth, which is quite significant because, Revelation here does not say exactly the content of the prophecy. What are they saying to the Babylonians? But the very fact that they are clothed in sackcloth suggests that they are preaching penance and conversion, because sackcloth was a traditional garment for penance. So most probably the two witnesses, like the prophets of the Old Testament, like John the Baptist at the beginning of the Gospels, and like Jesus himself, especially in the Gospel of Mark, the times are fulfilled, convert and believe in the Gospel. So I think the two witnesses preach conversion and penance to the Babylonians. And there are two olive trees. That's another image. It comes from the Old Testament, as usual. In that case, it is book of the prophet Zechariah, chapter 4. And we read at verse 5 and next verses of Zechariah 4. The angel who talked with me answered me, "This is the Lord to Zerubbabel, not by might, nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord of hosts." And later, verse 11, what are these two olive trees on the right and the left of the lampstand? And verse 14, the angel said, "These are the two anointed who stand by the Lord of the whole earth." In the context of the book of Zechariah, these two olive trees represent two anointed, and actually they were Zerubbabel on the one hand and Simon on the other hand. Zerubbabel, who was temporal authority, strictly speaking, he was not king of Israel because there were no longer any king of Israel after the exile in Babylon, but at least he had the authority. And Simon was the high priest. And so we, symbolically speaking, these two olive trees symbolize kingship on the one hand, priesthood on the other hand. Now, applied to the two witnesses in Revelation 11, we understand that the two witnesses are at the same time kings and priests, which exactly corresponds to what we have read already twice in the Apocalypse. 1:6, Christ has made us a kingdom, priest to his God and Father. The Christians are kings and priests. That's part of the grace they have received in baptism. Now, there are other points in the description of the two witnesses. If anyone would harm them, fire pours from their mouths and consume their foes, and if anyone would harm them, thus he is doomed to be killed. They have power to shut the sky, that no rain may fall during the days of their prophesying. They have power over the waters to turn them into blood, and to afflict the earth with every plague as often as they desire. If you are familiar enough with the Old Testament, you recognize some descriptions which in the Old Testament apply to Moses on the one hand and Elijah on the other hand. It was Moses who had the power to turn the waters into blood and to afflict the earth with every plague. That's exactly what Moses did in the book of Exodus. Think of the plagues of Egypt. Elijah, fire coming down from their mouth to consume their foes. That's what we read also in the second book of Kings, chapter 1. Twice the prophet Elijah consumed his enemies by fire. They have power to shut the sky that no rain may fall during the days of their prophesying. This too was something which Elijah did. First book of Kings, chapter 17. So the two witnesses would seem to be Elijah and Moses, but this does not mean that actually they are Moses and Elijah, but they are described as Moses and Elijah, who are actually two of the main characters in the history of Israel in the Old Testament. You could also say that Moses symbolizes the law, Elijah the prophets, and the law and the prophets give testimony to Christ. When they have finished their testimony, the beast that descends from the bottomless pit will make war upon them and conquer them and kill them. That beast is the one which shall be presented to us with much more details in chapter 13 of Revelation. But it is the same beast. When the two witnesses complete their mission of prophesying, then they are put to death by the beast. And their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which is allegorically called Sodom and Egypt, where two symbolic images. Sodom, the image of a corrupt city with corrupt customs. Just read the story of Sodom in Genesis 19. And Egypt, of course, forced labor, slavery, as we see in the book of Exodus. So, Babylon, symbolically speaking, it is at the same time Sodom, corruption of customs, and Egypt, forced labor and slavery. For 3.5 days, men from the peoples and tribes and tongues and nations gazed at their dead bodies and refused to lay them place in a tomb, which was a supreme insult, you see, to deprive somebody from burying it was considered as something terrible and very shameful. Why 3.5 days? I think that here you have another superposition of images. 3.5 days, it is close enough to 3 days in order for you to remember the 3 days of Jesus in the tomb after his crucifixion and before his resurrection. But it is not 3 days, but 3.5 days. Why? Because 3.5 are, you think of the period of religious persecution, 3.5 years. And those who dwell on the earth, so the Babylonians, will rejoice over them, make merry and exchange presents, because these two prophets have been a torment to those who dwell on the earth. But after the 3.5 days, a breath of life from God entered them. They stood up on their feet, and great fear fell on those who saw them. Then they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, "Come up here." And in the sight of their foes, they went up to heaven in a cloud. What does it mean? The two witnesses are put to death by the beast. Their corpses remain unburied for 3.5 days. And after that time, the two witnesses are raised from the dead by the Lord. And not only raised from the dead, but they go up to heaven. You see that basically the two witnesses follow in the footsteps of Jesus after preaching and giving witness to get testimony to the gospel. So the two witnesses follow in the footsteps of Christ. Passion, they are put to death. Resurrection, they are raised from the dead. Ascension, they go up to heaven. So you see that their story is modeled on Christ himself, preaching, conversion, persecution, passion, resurrection, ascension. And this is quite significant. Next time, we shall read the last verses of chapter 11 of the Apocalypse, and I will try to explain more into the details the meaning of the story of the two witnesses. I see you soon for the next conference.